Hi, all. Welcome, and thank you for joining the State Indian Ed Directors panel. We have several states represented here today, and I'm super excited to introduce our panelists. First, though, we have to do our standard disclaimer, and it should read it to you. Yes. Let's see.
No, you may have to share sound on your computer, share your computer sound. Go up to the view options and say share sound and it should work for you.
There we go. I have never done that before, so this
You're-
is new and exciting.
You're fine. You do. Then to go backward and
Okay, let's try this. No.
gotta go back to the first one.
Oh, so exciting.
Now you got it.
Now we'll go. All right. And
This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred.
all right, so I'm going to introduce our first panelist here is David O'Connor. David is the American Indian Studies consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Education and has been for about 8 years now. 9, David?
10.5.
10.5. All right. And has led quite a few initiatives with Wisconsin, including the effort to develop memoranda of understanding between the State Department of Public Instruction and the tribes in the state. And then I'm going to leave Joel's introduction for a moment because they're still waiting for him to be able to get on, and move on to Melissa and Jennifer from the Michigan Department of Education's Indigenous Education Initiative. And Melissa and Jen, can you tell us a little bit about the Indigenous Education Initiative and your work with them?
We can. I'll start first by a teaching that was shared to me about introducing yourself to new people and creation and my original language, Wabzikoi Dijnakas Name Dodem Saginaw Chippewa Keenan Donjaba Gijwasud and Donakshe. My name is Melissa Isaac, and I am a citizen of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe. I am Sturgeon Clan, and my official title with the Michigan Department of Education's Indigenous Education Initiative is Gijwasud, which is an Anishinaabemowin, and it means protector of the young. I'll turn it over to Jen.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Jen LaPointe. My role and function with the initiative is Mitarbeiten, which in my familial language in German is someone who works with and not does to. Been with the Department of Education in this role with the Indigenous Education Initiative for about 7 or 8 years now. So, Nara, do you want to wait to see if Joel's in?
It looks like Joel's Zoom is updating, so he should be joining us shortly.
I'm on now.
Hooray, welcome Joel. Joel is the project coordinator, tribal liaison for the Alaska Department of Education and Early Development. Joel, would you like to say a little bit about your role with the SEA?
Yes, Yagali Du Chinan, sorry for being late. I work for Alaska's Department of Education. I serve as the tribal liaison, and which means I get to interface with the 229 tribes in Alaska and kind of all things Alaska Native American Indian for Alaska. There's different projects that come through. We're working on a state tribal education compact bill process, cultural reading, those kinds of initiatives that kind of come up. I often spend time working with school district superintendents and tribes convening space and helping liaise and make connections that in those kinds of arenas. So that's a little bit about what I do at the department.
Excellent. Thank you, Joel. And I'm going to go into our session logistics. We've got a couple of questions that we're going to ask everyone to talk about. I'll introduce them one at a time. Everyone's going to have a chance to respond to each question, and then we'll do a little Q&A at the end of each question session. So if you have any questions for panelists, go ahead and put them in the chat on Pathable, and we will raise those up if you don't want to speak up. All right, so first question for all of you, and Michigan got voluntold to be up first for this one. How does your state education agency structure its approach to American Indian education?
So yeah, Michigan was voluntold. Thanks, Wisconsin. We see you across the lake. No, we're happy to go first, and Melissa and I are going to kind of tag team in here just so that we've got equal time between the three states that are represented in the panel. I think the short answer to this question is we've structured it a little bit differently than some of you on the line may be familiar with. In Michigan, we don't actually have an Office of Indian Education, and that is more common in other state agencies and partners that we work with across the country. When the initiative was named formally in 2016, we were really intentional that we didn't want the work to get pocketed in one particular office or division within the state agency, within that bureaucratic structure. So we had amazing leadership support at the time with our former state superintendent, and he was open to the idea of a real team approach and a relationship-based approach to how we structure our approach to Indigenous education, is how we refer to it in Michigan. So we are a team. We very much work in a kind of horizontal leadership structure. It's not vertical or hierarchical in that way. And there are 6 of us on that team right now. We're across the state of Michigan. One of our colleagues also lives in the state of Maine, which is always interesting to hear how things are going on the further East Coast. But really our approach has been a team-based approach within the agency, and we work across all of the state departments. So we have conversations and work partnerships with our title programs, special education, food and nutrition, early childhood, career tech ed. Really, we have the opportunity, as we're housed and sponsored in the superintendent's office, that we can work across the state agency as a whole. Melissa, I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Sure. So I am newest to the team. I joined in January, and I am a former tribal education director for my tribe, the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe, and collectively the tribes, the 12 federally recognized tribes in Michigan, meet quarterly and form what is known as the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Directors. And so we were engaged in relationship with the Indigenous Education Initiative, CMTED and IEI is kind of how we refer to it. And it took years to build that relationship. I was pregnant at the time, and my daughter's 5 now. And I remember when Jen and her colleagues first kind of entered our space, and how skeptical and distrusting I was. Like, whoa, what happened while I was on, while I'm, going, bringing life into the world. And so they kept showing up and were invested and showed that they were there to support and really do what was best for our learners. And so over the course of those years, we've strengthened that relationship to the point that I am now a part of the team because I believed in it so much. And early on, what they had established were 3 guiding principles to their work. And one of those guiding, I'll tell you what those guiding principles are, that the fundamental basis of effective consultation is recognition and respect of tribal sovereignty. The fact that we have a state agency acknowledging the sovereignty of tribes as one of their guiding principles was big to me. And, I just really appreciated that tribes are not merely a homogeneous stakeholder group, but are distinct sovereign nations that predate the formation of the United States, and therefore maintain a unique political status and should be engaged accordingly, was also something that I had never heard before from a state agency, because a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their head around the fact that we aren't simply in an ethnicity or a race, that we have a unique political status that should be respected. And then their last guiding principle was that communication and coordination with tribal partners are essential to the implementation of meaningful tribal consultation policy. And that, to me, translated to engaging us in conversations instead of telling us the decisions that are made. Like, here's what we came up with, we showed it to you, check, and moving on. And so it just really, those guiding principles really spoke to me. And now that I'm a part of the team, we've dug deeper into those guiding principles and have really established commitment statements that are very meaningful to the work that we do with CMTED in behalf of our Indigenous learners. And I'm going to ask Jen, is this because we kind of did some pre-gaming here, is this the part where we get into that, or are we holding on to that for later?
Let's hold on to that so we can hear
Got
from
it.
David and Joel.
All right.
In that order, David and Joel, would you like to chime in?
Certainly. So in terms of, first and foremost, good afternoon or good morning. Anita Minogijigad, to everyone here. So in terms of some of the work that we engage in here in the state of Wisconsin, so in terms of at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, we do have an American Indian Studies program. And so in terms of that role, I'm the one person who directly oversees that area or content specifically. And so a lot of work I do have an opportunity to engage in and dialogue with goes all the way up to our state superintendent's office, as well as other leadership, as well as on the team level as well. So we have different divisions, different areas that focus on different areas, from Title I to student services, all the way over to special education, career and technical education. And so a lot of work that I engage in with my fellow colleagues across our department or agency is to have them get to that space where they are leading a lot of that work in consultation or in partnership with myself. So it's not just, when a lot of times when Native education comes up, having it come to me directly and only to me overseeing it. I'm not a trained specialist in a lot of those areas. And so it's a win-win for each of us. When my colleagues on Title I, they have an area of expertise that I don't have. And so when we have engaged in dialogue, we can have that combination of partnership relationship to work on a lot of that work together, specifically, even like around consultations. Like a lot of times, we'll talk more about that in a different topic, either tribal consultations, memorandums of understanding, whatever the case may be. So it's more of a collective way of doing work. And so to make it our agency as a whole, as well as individual divisions, as well as individuals themselves, taking ownership out of that work. And so we feel very fortunate that build capacity over time where things come up, where folks can ask for technical assistance and guidance rather than, hey, David, need this as example. And so it's been a win-win on many different fronts for myself to learn about some of the inner workings of our agency, as well as the connection that folks can learn about the work that I specifically engage in, either providing technical assistance and support to either school districts in our state, to our First Nations as well. So very similar to what Melissa was talking about. In our state, we're home to 12 nations in our state, as well as in terms of our tribal education departments, making sure that they have the support as well in terms of whatever capacity or things that they would like to see, other different areas as well across our state. So a lot of work I do have opportunity to work with is across partnerships across our state, either being school districts, the things we call in our state, the regional things are called CESAs, Cooperative Educational Service Agencies. We have 12 of those in the state. School library, public libraries, school libraries, all the different entities that you can think of specific across our state, making sure that they have the support, inner workings of making sure that they have information for teaching and learning about our First Nations, as well as the education of our Native American students in our state. So those are a couple of different things as example in terms of way our state education agency approaches our work. So looking at it across collaboration opportunities, both internally as well as externally. And so even, so one way I build capacity to get to that space is I offer trainings internally for staff, where staff have to go, I call 4 different trainings in a sense where staff are encouraged to partake in. So there's four different ones specifically Part one, like intro to tribal nations of Wisconsin. Second one is around tribal sovereignty. And I go on a list of many different things. And so I wanted especially for new staff coming in, want them to have the understanding as how can they look at the work that they engage in and how it relates to supporting our First Nations students, families, communities, and nations across our state as example. And so I try to look at it from multiple different ways to get to that space. So for folks like either myself or my colleagues have that opportunities. And so, but other work that we engage in, besides the amazing work that we try to engage with our First Nations directly, which we'll talk more about with our MOUs and tribal consultation, as well as with the Tribal Education Department. We work directly with our Wisconsin Indian Education Association as well, which is our association in the state of Wisconsin that has a mix of many different amazing different folks across the state that work on Native education, as well as I have the opportunity to connect with one of our organizations in Wisconsin called Great Lakes Intertribal Council. And we also have the opportunity to serve as a liaison to the Special Committee on State Tribal Relations. So that's just a kind of combination of a couple different things that we have here in Wisconsin that I can circle back to as well. So thanks.
Great. And Joel, I know you've got a different structure in Alaska as well. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, Janan for having me be able to share a little bit about my home state. So I am from Alaska, and the Department of Education in Alaska structure is we have our State Board of Education, and then we have a commissioner, and we're very, very much a local control state with local school boards and then superintendents. That's kind of the structural piece of how we're organized. My position as the tribal liaison for the department is located in the commissioner's office. So and I interface with the State Board of Education. There's a subcommittee that's focusing on tribal compacting as the title of that committee. But one of the things, as has been said in other sessions throughout this gathering, is a lot of our students are in the regular public school system, not in some type of tribally run K-12. And in Alaska, we have one reservation. And other than that, there's not reservation status. We're not a reservation system state. So there's some things that are a little bit different in Alaska for that federal trust responsibility that affect how an SEA interfaces with tribes. So one of the approaches that we're doing is with this subcommittee is really building capacity within our state leadership on the state board and addressing issues that will help thinking about system changes that empower tribal ownership of education. What are mechanisms like teacher prep pathways that can help at that system-wide level in a tribally operated school, but also in our regular standard Western system K-12 schools. So that's part of the approach that we're using, is thinking about how do we bring those Indigenous tribal voices to the table to help construct solutions to our existing structure and then really guide the work for changing, like a systems change. So that's the approach that we use. And that's, I'm speaking a little bit more to like, what does that look like from a policy standpoint, that executive leadership team kind of level of work that affects all the students in the state? And what are those regulatory pieces? What are statutory pieces? That's kind of the approach that we've been using right now as one employee in a department with about 34,000 students who are Alaska Native American Indian, thinking about how do we structurally impact and benefit those students. But really, it's not about separating out. It's about helping all the students and that connection, because we aren't a segregated community as a whole, as a state. So that's kind of the approach, the nuts and bolts of it, but also how I think about it and how we kind of think about what are the strategies we have to use to benefit our Alaska Native American Indian students in the environment that they are at today.
So 3 states and 3 very different structures and approaches. Do you have questions for the panelists? If you do, go ahead and post them in the chat box. and we will discuss. I just want to note for you, Melissa, that Cecilia Hudson in the chat has some of your students in the North Pole, Alaska elementary schools. So,
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Amazing. Oh, I hope they're doing good. Thank you for sharing that, Cecilia. That's so interesting.
she says they're amazing students. And Joel, I see we have one of your neighbors in Kenai here as well. Krista Pitch.
Awesome. Right next door. That's, yeah.
Any questions for any of our panelists about how they're structured, how the Indian Ed interactions are structured at the state level?
So while we're waiting now, I'll just add a couple things that I didn't get a chance to share, if that's all right.
Yes, please.
So it's very similar to what Joel was talking about, folks. Wisconsin, we're also a local patrol state as well. And so a lot of times what that means, like, for example, in our state curriculum is determined by the local school board. So we have over 400 plus school boards across Wisconsin. Each of them determine what standards they adopt, in terms of curriculum, whatever the case may be, for students in their district specifically. And so a lot of times, a lot of work I engage in, as I talked about earlier, is having someone that one-to-one with our districts and or with our regional offices, specifically our CISAs, and having a partnership relationship with them who can support the work that I engage with them, especially around teaching and learning, which are in our state. We have a law often referenced as Wisconsin Act 31, which most people, when I break that down, it's a state requirement that all school districts across Wisconsin, as well as pre-service education programs, are required to have an opportunity to, that must provide instruction on Wisconsin, specifically to our state, Wisconsin, American history, culture, and tribal sovereignty. And so there's a lot of different statutes that relate to that area, as example, that have been in existence since 1989.
You always make us a little green with envy, David, when we get to talk about the fact that you have that there.
I'm not seeing a lot of questions in the chat here. Let's see. Okay, so Thomas Genny, and I'm sorry, Thomas, if I am pronouncing your last name incorrectly, asks, in Alaska, how are the REAAs, which you're going to have to unpack for me, Joel, represented in the state public education department? And can you offer examples of the effects of their influence or participation?
Great question. So REAA stands for Regional Education Attendance Area. We have organized boroughs, unorganized boroughs, regional attendance areas. Alaska has a lot of very small schools. So our threshold for an REAA school is 10 students or more is what it takes for that school to stay operational. And that number has ticked up. I believe it used to be 8. And so thinking very, very small schools, and there's a lot of them. And thinking about ways an REAA it's a way of organizing a district in a way that you might have a city be a district, or districts might be a borough. So thinking about going across vast regions, like if you were to have a geographic region the size of Ohio, how would you do that kind of thing? And so that's our REAA structure. It's just very large, other state-sized school districts with a very small amount of students and very big distances. So that's what an REAA is in Alaska. That's one of the challenges that we get to. It's a challenge and an opportunity. And the different ways they have, it's a district status, and so it functions as a local education agency. There are different statutory frameworks that support REAAs for things like school construction. There's an REAA doesn't have the local contribution tax base like a borough or a city does. So this kind of gets into some very granular, how do we fund education? What does supports look like for our districts in that mechanism? So that's a little bit of the background of what an REAA looks like in Alaska. So the state aid and federal aid still flows into an REAA, and then REAA districts are able to collaborate with other districts. So one of the things that from a department work that I've done is trying to connect school districts, especially REAs that are trying to do the same things, so that they're not having to duplicate those efforts. One of the other, thinking about either standards developments or curricula, especially like place-based curricula development, thinking about if this is a subsistence calendar that's based off of seasons, so like rather than saying in October you're going to do this kind of fishing, in December you're going to do whaling, and this you're going to do this. It's more of asking questions of when do your birds come, when do your fish come, when does this happen, so that your community can answer those. And one REA might be developing something like that. And rather than just copying and pasting the exact thing, it's going through and explaining the process and having that local community or that other local REA go through and do that same question answer process, so they can build up something that's it's place-based, land-based. And that's one of the, I think, the more successful ways that the state and the REAs have been able to support for achieving those things they're wanted, because there's just such small numbers of professionals working in the educational arena due to the population size. That's how do we multiply those support structures is I think the success, but also the challenge simultaneously.
And Joel, is there an informal process for that, or is it a formal community of practice? How do you find the people who are doing the thing and connect them with the people who want to do the thing?
So there's two routes. The more formal routes is through like the Association of School Boards and those kinds of statewide principals associations, those kinds of places where the educators who are in those networks can network with similar sized districts. And the informal way is, I would say, is call the department and ask for me. My email and my phone number are on the department page. We have a compacting web page that has my email on it, but that's one of those pieces where there's some really interesting things that are happening, and the REAs are calling department and not necessarily telling each other what they're doing. And we see this in the language work, where one language family might be doing this really amazing immersion process or program or dual language program, and they're developing curricula, and that district's like this powerhouse of cranking out materials, and a neighboring district might see that, and they reach out to that district support office and say, hey, we're in the same language family, but we're like sister languages. Can we see what you're doing? And then we're going to adapt our dialect to that. So that's kind of the informal process, is that usually the ones that are bordering kind of more language family related can do that, but there's other bigger picture pieces. So just reaching out to the department is another way to kind of get hooked into that pulse of the state if you're having a hard time getting into that more informal side of the network.
That is one thing that always blows my mind about states that have one person. As I had a question about something in Alaska when you were out of the office, and I think I cold called 3 different large statewide organizations. They all said, have you talked to Joel? So he's not kidding, folks. So you're actually going to go to his website and email him. I want to kind of combine a question from the chat box with our next question, because I think that they're related. So our next question is about how your office obtains the information that you need to inform your efforts to support American Indian students in your state. And Angela Hernandez from the OIE had asked in the chat box, are there formal or informal opportunities or processes for you to learn how local public and or BIE schools are using federal formula, Title VI, or discretionary funds to support Native students? So I think those are related questions. So if we can talk a little bit about how you get your information, other than people just cold emailing you, Joel. I'd like to start off with you this time. David has dibs on being first for the third question. So in backward order, if you don't mind.
Okay, sounds good. So I think that's a great question. It's there's different driving forces for how data is collected. And some are through federal programs require a certain level of data collection. For Alaska, there are state statutes that require certain amounts of data collection, and then what that reporting process looks like. So we have a very interactive web page that you can drill down to every single school in the state and see what its report card is and what the data that they're collecting is posted there. One of the things that when we're doing this process for Alaska is if we get below a certain school size, the data is collected, but because it becomes student identifiable, a lot of the really, really small schools, it's a different process for how we present that information so that you're not able to just know who is the 1 3rd grader in this village, because there might just be one. And that's one of the tricky things about the data collection. One of the things that we're working on updating right now is for thinking about the ways that districts collect information for federal programs that satisfy some of the reporting requirements that the state has. So for Alaska, we have a statute that requires if a majority of the students in a school are Alaska Native American Indian, that district has to provide a advisory board for curricula to support that school. And going through that data collection process to make sure that the districts are collecting that data and then interpreting it to know that they have to do this thing from what the data says. So that's part of the process for one, like really, I would say a specific example of how we're using data. One of the things that is tricky about there's still one statute that uses blood quantum as an identifier. And that's one of the limitations that we have with collecting Alaska Native American Indian or Indigenous data is how are you defining who the student is and getting them to actually report it. And so that's a little bit about some of the things that we're trying to work through still. And I'll pause there, but that's just kind of a little bit of a brushstroke of how we do that in Alaska is through that dashboard process that the districts supply.
Does that give you any information about what your Title 7, Title 6
Title
grantees now?
6 is, I would say there is a desire for more information about Title 6 programming. I oftentimes hear things not going well more than people don't call and say, hey, this is going so great, I just want to tell you. They're usually saying, this thing's broken. And there are some really rock star Title VI programs where tribes feel like they're heard and they're involved. In order to report that kind of data, I don't have a mechanism right now for a box that's checked or a comment that's checked that says, does your tribe feel like your Title VI program in your district is meeting your needs? That kind of, from a tribal voice perspective, hearing that in the kind of raw data is something that I usually am reaching out for. People are calling and letting me know about, and then we kind of look at it and see what's going on. And then if there is a really positive one, it's like, hey, talk to this district because they figured out how to do this. Anyway, that's, yeah.
Thanks, Joel. And I know, David, you have some things going on in Wisconsin too about how you're collecting your data and then how you're working with your districts. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. So to just tie in hand with the question that Angela asked in the chat box. So any of our Title VI or Johnson O'Malley funding that we get in the state of Wisconsin actually directly does not go through our state agency at all. So I actually don't have any oversight or work on that directly specifically, other than at the conclusion of the year when I get reports from individual school districts. But in terms of the funding, they go directly from the federal level all the way to the school districts directly. Majority of them are school districts that receive that funding. In terms of, there is One Nation in Wisconsin that actually does get that directly to them, and then they disperse it to the school districts that their students that are adjacent to in their local school districts in the state of Wisconsin. And so in terms of context as well, when I heard early on, the vast majority of our Indigenous students or Native students do attend public schools in Wisconsin, 90% plus, if not more. We do have 3 tribal schools, BIE schools in Wisconsin. We also have a private tribal school as well, Indian Community School. And so just want to put some context on that in terms of both the Title VI and or Johnson O'Malley funding specifically, where it doesn't flow through our agency, either at the state level, but directly to our school districts and or to the nation, one of those nations in our state. So in terms of data collection itself, a lot of our information that we do receive come directly from our school districts in Wisconsin, specifically where we house it, specifically on a website called WISE Dash, Wisconsin Information System for Education Data Dashboard. I know it's a mouthful. There's a public portal where you can actually look at comparison analysis between maybe your school district and other school districts that are adjacent to you, or other information ranging from student achievement, graduation rates, truancy, other different information, that anything that you could think of, we collect as example. And a lot of information that we do collect, especially work that I engage in, helps inform some of the different initiatives or different things that we'd like to see done, different programming that I offer. A lot of things that I always tell folks is that a lot of my work is based on some of those information, specifically trying to help address either if it's around disproportionality in special education, all over to student achievement, whatever the case may be specifically. But and that's where a lot of times definitely that's that strong opportunity where we have those internal as well as external partnerships to help build some of that capacity as we move forward. So
Thank you, David. Jen and Melissa. Anything, both questions about how you get your information that you're acting on at the SEA, and then that specific question about Title VI and BIE and local public schools' use of discretionary funds.
We're looking at each other through the Zoom to figure out who's going to go first. So I can answer Angela's question, and I think it will actually tie in with how we think about information in Michigan. There definitely is a data component to it, but we also think of information very relationally and not transactionally. Is kind of one of the tenets of how we approach the work. But Angela, to your question, we do now. I think in our response to the first question about our approach, up until 2014, 2015, when this work was getting started in Michigan in the agency, till it was formally named in 2016, there wasn't anything, quite candidly. A couple of us came back to Michigan from working in other places, like South Dakota and Minnesota, and kind of looked around at the State Department. We're like, where's your work with the tribes? So we're building that. Right now, our first lift was to really build that relationship back up with the tribes, and specifically with the tribal education departments that Melissa is going to talk a little bit more about. But then really looking to the local districts and the supports that they needed. Not getting into too many details, we actually have a written policy in Michigan that outlines the process to co-govern between our state department and our tribal education departments. And when we work with our local districts, we show up together, and it's an opportunity for them to see how we model that relationship as well. But we actually have now this. If you meet our colleague Nate sometime, this is kind of his whole area of interest. He has a local district community of practice that's been formed and has met several times over the last couple of years, launched it during a pandemic, and really trying to build those relationships and get a better sense of what their programs. What we found, quite candidly, is that it wasn't necessarily in the space of Title VI. The door we had that we walked through that was incredibly helpful from the federal level was the requirement for affected local districts through ESSA. And that gave us an opportunity around affirmations of consultative relationships and things like that, that got us into more of an information space and a dialogue between the tribal ed departments and the local districts to figure out how are things going and use of funds and programmatic elements and evaluation. That was a real game changer for us in the early years of the work.
I guess that would be turned over to me. So one of the first meetings that we had with the Indigenous Education Initiative back in my tribal education director days, We met and they showed us, because there is a dashboard here in Michigan as well, the My School Data dashboard, and it collects race and ethnicity data and a whole like plethora of information, quantitative information. And so we sat there and we reviewed what that components of that system contained. And as tribal education directors, we were like, what? Like, where did you get that from? One that sticks out directly to me was like, oh, a majority of your students are English language learners. And we're like, they are? Like, we're like, what? You know, so we were all, this generated this discussion that, you know, maybe we have some accuracy issues here and maybe we need to continue to have these conversations. And so as the work has developed and the relationship has been strengthened, we have conversations and we've done a series of focus groups with the tribal education directors so that we could identify shared priorities. The data that they're collecting from their citizens and that they track for their citizens, that's how they inform their tribal education system programming. And so we've done a couple of rounds of those, and at the end of the day, we're all trying to achieve the same thing. And to us, when we approach that in a relational way, is more informative of how we at the state education agency need to drive our programming so that it's a shared responsibility to our learners between the state and the tribe. And so that's one thing that we have found very helpful, is to also collect that qualitative data and hear what is happening directly from the tribes to inform state education agency planning. So yeah, a little bit about that.
So
Thank
just,
you.
I was gonna add just one thing
Go ahead.
as well in terms of talk about data collection. So as many of my colleagues on the panel here, I know I've shared this past year, we just rolled out another data collection point specifically around tribal affiliation. That was something that was asked by our nation's leaders across Wisconsin, specifically asking about how we make sure that we know where our students are, our citizens of our nations across the state are, as example. And so this past year, we rolled out the tribal affiliation, which I'll share a link to in our chat box so you can see as a reference piece. Something that we've been building on, working on for a good number of years now. And we got to that space where we're able to roll it out this past fall, 2021. Definitely, you know, it's another point where we can collect information, knowing exactly our students across Wisconsin, as well as our students who maybe call Wisconsin, but their nations maybe outside of Wisconsin as well.
Yeah, that's a really exciting new development, David. I think, Melissa, there's a question in the chat that actually leads off of some of what you were talking about. Douglas Ruman asked, some states, particularly in regions serving higher proportions of American Indian and Alaska Native families, have curriculum, resources, and data services relevant to Indian Ed. Are there formal structures built within SEAs that deal with relations with tribal communities? That is, communication and information between public education officials and the tribal communities. Montana has this underway, but I am curious about this in other places.
Do you want to start that one out, or do you want me to?
Either way, the short answer is yes, but
I know, I'm like, how do I formulate this?
I know it's kind of a big thing to narrow down.
Yeah, I think I'll start this off, and then Jen, if you want to chime in. Excellent question, and that is the dream, right? To have like this very effortless, smooth flow of, you know, accurate information about our tribal nations, and that's woven into the fabric of our LEAs, the local education agencies, and such. The way that we have things and the co-construction of what we're doing, there have been opportunities. I think our approach, or I know our approach from the SEA, is to lift up the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Directors as the creators of that information. And we come in and we support that. And when there are opportunities to share that among the public school districts within Michigan, we push it out for them. CMTED is the acronym for the Tribal Education Directors, has, for example, for social studies, they've been involved with the update of the standards to make sure that there was representation. And then they created this wonderful resource guide to help teachers know how to inform instruction about tribal nations that goes past, in a certain date in history, we just end. And we know that's not really the case. And so they formulated this beautiful resource guide with the help of Wisconsin and David's guidance, miigwech for that. And then the SEA came in and said, okay, how can we help promote opportunities for them to share that, so that it's never something about tribal nations that the SEA created on their behalf. It's the SEA lifting the tribal education departments in the construction of that knowledge, and providing support and resources how we can. So, Jen, if you want to go from there.
Yeah, I think, Douglas, I love that question. I like how you're really thinking about that relationship with relations. I mean, I think that's the root of what we've been trying to build here. And we've been, I don't know how many of you on the line heard Alex Redcorn's keynote this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. And he talked about all of the system interactions and interconnections and the system thinking. And it just kind of, I don't know, made my heart happy thinking about that, because we've been really fortunate here in Michigan that we have an amazing support from our governor's office, from the executive branch. There's a requirement in the state of Michigan that if you're a state agency, you have to have a consultation policy on file with the governor's office on how you as a state agency are going to work with tribal nations in the state. That was issued in fall of 2019. Again, we kind of had like this perfect storm, like these things were starting to form and these relationships were starting to work. And then we had ESSA was reauthorized and the governor's executive directive came in. It was kind of all these different system levels were all coming together at the same time to basically say, get this figured out, do this the right way. We really think of it as a relationship, not an event, that consultative relationship. But that is the responsibility we have as the initiative on behalf of the state agency, is to be that relationship with between the state agency and the tribes. So having a team that's designated from the state agency to do that, and then having specific policies that were written, co-written, like Melissa said, with our tribal ed departments and reviewed by elected officials. It's the foundation we needed, and now we're building on it from there. Hopefully that answers your question, Douglas. That's a hard one to wrap up in a few minutes. Happy to talk more.
Well, and of course, all of these questions are related to one another. So I asked Douglas's question and David's messaging me in the chat. This is related to question number 3. So here we are at question number 3. And I think if we can talk a little bit more about this in the context of data sharing specifically and memoranda of understanding, but also obviously this is a key aspect of what we do with consultation. David, you're up.
Certainly. Thank you, Nora. And so as going back to the question that was asked in the chat box, as I said, a good dovetail into the conversation here. So in our state, folks, our state agency, we're not part of it's like some other states that part of governor's cabinet, because we are elected officials. So our state superintendent, he or she or they are elected to that position in our state, not appointed in our, like some other states, as example, or many other states. And so our person that is elected official that serves a 4-year term. And so one of the things that a couple of years ago, our agency did specifically was start building what we call memorandums of understanding. And I just did put it in the chat box, folks, direct links to those memorandums of understanding. So you have opportunity to kind of see what are some of the things that are entailed in some of those agreements, specifically across our state. And so a lot of times you can see as one of the examples that we have an agreement on in our state that goes across the board, regardless of the nations that we do have assigned agreements with, is direct communication. So anytime we have anybody who's elected to that position, either being a president or chair, whatever the case may be, any information that we send out to district administrators and other entities in the state of Wisconsin, our tribal chairs or presidents and their executive assistants, including their tribal education directors, are included on that firsthand. So they're not getting information, a week or 2 weeks or a month later. They're actually seeing it firsthand. Anything that goes out to our school districts across Wisconsin, which comes directly from our state superintendent's office, they get that firsthand communication. That's been in place now since fall of 2017. And so we make sure that anytime there's anybody who is newly elected to that position, we make sure that I update that with our state superintendent's office and make sure that gets trickled down, making sure that those individuals get that information readily available to them across their states. As you look through some of the other memorandums of understanding, some of the, as you can talk about as shared on the screen, talk about data sharing agreements. We talk about things around special education. So it's not just a topic, there's multiple topics. And what we try to do with our memorandums of understanding is honoring the individual sovereignty of each nation. So when you look at them, there may be some things that overlap, but there's also some things that don't. And that what we wanted to make sure that we did as an agency is make sure that we honored the sovereignty of that nation that we were having that memorandum of understanding with directly, so they can have making sure that we meet the needs of them, but at the same time, working with them in terms of our work moving forward, in terms of whatever that may be. We also have, besides the memorandums of understanding themselves directly with each nation, since 2018, we also have tribal consultation. Now in Wisconsin, our state agencies are required to have tribal consultation since 2004. That was signed by a previous governor, Jim Doyle, back in called Executive Order 39. Our current governor, who used to be our state superintendent in Wisconsin, he re-signed that when he took over office back in 2019 to be called Executive Order 18. And so the idea behind that was to strengthen continue to build our relationship capacity between all of our state agencies, including the state agents as well as the nations themselves. And so annual consultation, or in terms of more meetings as needed in terms of meeting the needs of those individual nations as example. But our agency, as I just talked about early on, we're not part of that governor's cabinet because we're not, but we make sure that we are committed to making sure we support our First Nations in Wisconsin, both through the tribal consultation process and or through the memorandums of understanding as a couple of key examples as in our state.
Thank you, David. Michigan or Alaska, which of you would like to chime in on this one next?
I might jump in because it's a short answer, and then in Michigan, you have maybe a little bit longer to formulate your thought. This is a high need area in Alaska. So that kind of MOU structure for sharing data, there's the data the department collects is public information, but the data or the information that the tribes might have is something that without a lightning rod, like a grant, either a federal grant that we're MOU partners on with that tribe, there's not a wholesale system that addresses this kind of need. Where we're at with this is one of the things that has come up, and how do we get there for the process that we're developing is this was right before the pandemic hit. I'd cold called every tribe in the state, all 229 of them. It took about 2.5, 3 weeks trying to get in, just contact information as a first step for how do we do this kind of work. And then the pandemic happened and is this the ongoing nature of our world and now. And what we've come up with as kind of the version 0.1 is doing a tribal leader newsletter as a way for developing that relationship between the state agency and tribal nations. So there's starting to have those lines of communication, because those lines of communication aren't firmly in place. They're only kind of on an as needed basis. And that's been one of the pieces for the data sharing for what it looks like. And really the question that's what comes up next possibly in our development of the answer to this question is, who has the authority to ask what question? Because tribes are wanting, this is coming up in the compacting conversations, what does success of a tribal school look like? That's a huge data collection point. But there are many different ways to answer that. And so that's really the approach that I've been thinking about, and the feedback that we're getting on this from the tribal side of the relationship is we want to be able to define what kind of questions are being asked. And that's just kind of, that's the short answer of where we're at in Alaska right now. And so I'll stop there, but that's where we're at.
I love the distinction that you made between a grant that can act as a lightning rod to get a one-time event to happen and kind of a more systemic approach to these things. I think Jen and Melissa, you've been working on some systemic approaches in Michigan. If you could tell us about them.
Nara, specific to the data work?
You can tell us about whatever you want, but yes, we're talking here about data sharing agreements and MOUs. So if that's what you think is most relevant, carry on.
Well, I go back to Melissa's reference, her story earlier about being in the state agency, 5-6 years ago, and the state showing up, our team showing up with, here's what we have, like, look, we finally can have a conversation about data. And one of our former colleagues was sitting at the end of the table, and after we finished, he was like, that's really nice, but that's so wrong. Like, it's so off. Like he said, at the time, he said, I would guess that's probably 50% off in terms of the accuracy of numbers that we had. That tribe at the time actually approached the state agency to have a formalized data sharing agreement. I will tell you, living through that process, for when I talk about this, it feels like it's been 15 years. It's not, it's been like 4. To try to get an actual formalized data sharing agreement has been an exercise in patience, like none that I've ever had professionally. And it's really because of the existing systems. They are just throwing up barriers. You have tribes, the state, the governor, everybody kind of wanting to figure this out and just not being able to break through some of those existing legacy systems. So we've had to go a couple of different routes. And I think where we are right now is in a new place. We finally were able to confirm that percentage of inaccuracy last fall. In Michigan, we're about 63% undercounting Indigenous students in the state. And so getting an actual number to verify the concern we had around data accuracy got everybody back to the table to say, we have to fix this. And the best champions we have right now are elected leaders in Michigan, elected tribal leaders in Michigan. They are collaboratively working with us to try to figure this out legislatively, executively. We have amazing support from our state superintendent to get this fixed. So we're in a new space, but Joel, to your point, how it will look and what we're going to collect, those are the conversations that we need to have. And again, with our collaborative governance policy, we won't make that decision alone, that we made in partnership with our tribes. But just getting people to understand that it's a political distinction, not race and ethnicity, has been kind of that wash, rinse, repeat conversation that you think about having to have every single time we're with people, just reminding them race, ethnicity is over here. We're talking about something different over here, and getting them to almost physically move their heads to realize we're talking about something in a different way. And they're getting it. We're moving forward. I would say I'm cautiously optimistic.
So Nara, I just wanted to add one thing, just as you talked about earlier, kind of looking at all 3 questions, how they overlap in many different ways. So one of the things that, like I said, we heard from our tribal nations, our First Nations, Wisconsin, was asking about food sovereignty, in a sense. How different foods that we would have across our state, how they could be implemented into our meal program across Wisconsin. And so we heard it loud and clear. And so our agency, as example, worked on an initiative around traditional foods in Wisconsin. And so we partnered with a couple different entities in Wisconsin. I'll put the link to that in the chat. It's very similar to other resources I've been sharing out at different times. But one of the things that we created specifically was called American Indian Traditional Foods in USDA's School Meals Program, a Wisconsin Farm to School Toolkit. And one thing that, as we look at some of those different foods that are discussed in there, they meet state codes as well as federal codes, but at the same time meet the needs of our First Nations asking for their foods being implemented or being part of the school meal program, as example. And so a lot of things that we try to do in Wisconsin is, as I talked about earlier, feedback that we get and how we can move across agency. And so that work specifically, I work with my school nutrition team, as once again, it's not just the American Indian Studies program at the state office, our state education office working on it, but different teams or divisions in our agency working on different projects that not only benefit our Indigenous students or Native students, but benefit all students in Wisconsin. So I'll put a link in there as a reference for you to check that out as an example.
I just want to also provide some input on, Nara mentioned that, we're trying to do things, trying to change things systemically. And one of those things is really getting rid of the devaluing of Indigenous knowledge systems in the work that we do. So when we talk about relationship, we're not talking about a checklist. We're talking about this continuous interaction, like a real relationship. And that paired with the Western knowledge system, how powerful that could be. And really asking ourselves when it comes to data, what are our measures of success through an Indigenous lens, not simply academic data, things of that nature. And so the way that we approach the work and the way that we commit to it is a lot different. And I do want to, because I just feel so strongly about the work that we do and standing behind the commitment statements that our team from an SEA have constructed. It's going to take about a little over 2 minutes because I timed it, but we have 7 commitment statements that I'm going to read and that I'm very proud of, because this really speaks to how we view and approach the work. And to me, that's a success. That was one of the words that stuck out to me on that last question, were successes. And so as a Michigan Department of Education's Indigenous Education Initiative team, we are dedicated to working in 7 action areas that ensure advancement of Indigenous education. These action areas are all equally important and consist of virtues that keep us grounded in the work and continually aspiring to do things in the right way. As a team, we commit to honor relationships. Relationship is the foundation from which we live and learn. We acknowledge and respect the relationships of others. We work to continue nurturing our current relationships and keep ourselves open to engaging in new relationships. We also practice Indigenous servant leadership. So to be of service to tribal nations and Indigenous communities is a privilege. As a team, we specifically subscribe to the virtues of Indigenous servant leadership, which are rooted in humility and value Indigenous youth. The construct of leadership does not belong only to the educated or to the elected, but is innate to all Indigenous peoples. We also commit to indigenizing the narrative. So interrupting forces that perpetuate inequity, invisibility, and erasure of Indigenous learners requires a shift in how data are collected, analyzed, and reported. We understand the power of data and affirm to support tribal nations in the acquisition of a more accurate educational landscape for their citizens. We commit to disrupt the status quo. So we have a moral obligation to resist the historic and ongoing marginalization and educational inequities of Indigenous learners. We prioritize the necessity to rely on Indigenous knowledge systems as the expert perspective in our work. We commit to evolutionize kinship. Individuals thrive in healthy systems that maintain safety, belonging, and cooperative environments. We value our kinship ties by working in truth, honesty, as well as supporting the wellness of ourselves and each other. As a team, we practice self-reflection and challenge our own assumptions. As allies in the work, we remain open to new perspectives and possibilities for connection, solidarity, and common ground. We commit to center on the sacred. Indigenous learners are the driving force essential to improving educational systems. We accept the responsibility of keeping Indigenous learners as the focus of our work. We accept our role in creating and facilitating safe spaces for these sacred beings. And then our last commitment is to transform systems. There's no place for systems that do not work or perpetuate harm. We are mindful that variations of harmful systems are not acceptable. We are aware that transformed systems must be sustainable to create lasting change. And that was from the focus groups that we've had, and we're like, all right, we need to commit to this, and we need to commit to it in an Indigenous knowledge system frame. And so that's one of the successes that I've had the honor of experiencing since transferring and making the transition to a state education agency system.
Thank you, Melissa. And if you want to revisit those 7 commitments, you can find them in both Melissa and Jen's speaker bios on Pathable. We've got about 10 minutes left for questions. I'm not seeing any right now in the chat, but if you have questions for our panelists or would like to hear them elaborate on anything we've talked about thus far, go ahead and put that in the chat. And Jen and Melissa, what is your FTE for the initiative? Like, how many staff do you have?
Total?
Mm-hmm.
So we have 6 members of the team. We're actually in the process of bumping one of them up from a half position to a full. But five of the 6 are full-time positions. And then we also have a liaison to the governor's office, and that's I don't know what her FTE is. She's in her other role, she's the director of the Office of Special Education for the state. And then we have a sponsoring deputy that's in the superintendent's office, and that's on an as-needed basis, not a specific FTE dedicated to that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yep.
So I'm just asking because I think that a lot of what state education agencies can do and the relationships that they can maintain is directly connected to how many folks they have to do the work. I mean, David's like 10 people all by himself, and Joel's at least 12, but we can't all be David and Joel, you know.
That's what I was talking about earlier, Nara, is that building capacity with your colleagues, especially if they're content experts or feel very much more knowledgeable in specific areas than myself, either being psychologists or school counselors, all the way over to our Title I folks, is have an opportunity to partner and work with them directly to make sure that the needs of our individuals across our state are being met, specifically the programming, trainings, professional development, whatever the case may be, curriculum, all the way through different areas that we want to make sure that folks are aware of and making sure we can best support our Indigenous students or Native students in our state.
The one thing I would add to, Nara, just for those on the line, this is also why we advocated really strongly at the beginning that it not be a single kind of that we requested and were accepted into the space of being an initiative across the agency as opposed to being housed in one place. David, I so agree in terms of that shared capacity within the agency, the fact that we can call the title director anytime, the fact that we can get a hold of CTE. It's just when you have that internal relationship in addition to the external, I mean, there's so much content you'd have to know to be able to hold all that, and having that shared capacity within the agency is amazing. Totally agree with that. We would be lost with a lot of our colleagues that are not officially named to the initiative, but are really strong partners with us in the work.
I think that's one of the, like, what that looks like in Alaska. Thinking about, it reminds me of being part of a tribe where you're doing so many different things as a tribal government, where one leader might be doing transportation, safety, education, and technology, where when we're in a state agency, it's like, well, that's a whole department with a cabinet member and like supports and all these different things. And I think that's been one of the successful things for Alaska, is that where my position is positioned allows me to network across the entire department. So, and that's strongly encouraged. It's very, even though there's different divisions of the department, there's clear lines of communication top to bottom, so that there's not barriers for somebody who has to go up a ladder, across, then back down a ladder to try and have a conversation. So I think that's one of the ways that we as a department statewide in Alaska have been able to work well. It'd be great to have more people help with the work. Not saying that I would be opposed to that. That'd be great. But I think that's one of the ways that has been successful. And one of the strategies that I've used and I invest time with, the department invest times in, is having those conversations with the different divisions, either as projects come up or just kind of a regular standing meeting to talk about like, how do we make the mission of our department as a state agency align with supporting every student. And sometimes we have to ask the question, is this supporting Alaska Native students? Because they are part of that every student. And we're hearing that they're not feeling supported. So having conversations like that, where we have to ask those kind of pointed questions, and the ways of looking at data where it comes back, where it's like, this district is 98% Alaska Native. We need to be aware and think about what the solutions look like, and having those tough conversations that have very pointed questions that are data informed, but also are informed by the community voicing their concerns, and not just a percentage point on paper. And finding that kind of synergy between those two is where I think the most successful movement and student improvement has happened in our state. So that's kind of how I think about that for the Alaska arena.
Yeah, I love that, Joel. I think right now, if I had to assess kind of in all the different systems of the education structure, the one that we probably have the biggest shift and focus is into our internal agency. Because as the team has grown, great, go give it to them. They'll go do it. And really pivoting it back to say, we're a team to support not just the external relationships, but the internal learning as well. It's definitely kind of these layers of, relationships with the tribes, the local districts, and the internal, because it can't just be as a designated person or peoples to do that work. It's everybody.
Thanks all. I am not seeing new questions in the chat box. I am seeing a great deal of praise for those 7 statements. So thank you for sharing those, Melissa. For those of you who want to hear more from any of our folks, we do have some contact information here, and I'm going to encourage you. It's not too late to ask a question, but I'd also like to encourage you to go to the polls and do the thing where you rate the session from 1 to 5 stars, with 5 being this was an awesome session, and 1 being eh. I won't tell you how to vote. Anyone have anything else that you want to add here before we wrap up this session?
I think maybe one last thought is how to get the student voice into this arena or this topic about data. That's been a really important piece of the work that we have what's called a First Alaskans Institute does an Elders and Youth Conference every year that brings together thousands of people, or depending on which year and the location that can hold it. But hearing directly from them what they're experiencing is a really important part of data collection and how we get those voices to legislative, governor, commissioner, statewide agency level tables. And so that's been one of the things that I think sometimes gets overlooked. And so I always try and find opportunities to bring that state voice into what's being, or that student voice unfiltered, not through questions, not through a bubble test, to have that be represented.
Thank you, Joel.
I just wanted to say, first and foremost, thank you to our facilitator of our panel. Just want a big shout out to Nara. Nara does amazing work, folks, for us as SCA folks who work at as director level, whatever term we want to use here today. And just want a big shout out to her in front of my colleagues here, as well as in front of you as well. And so I also want to say miigwech to each of you for everything that you do as well for our students, our families, our communities, as well as our nations across the United States in many different realms. And hope our paths do cross at a certain time, and miigwech for the opportunity to share a little bit about Wisconsin.
I share those sentiments, David, and I know that watching you pave the way for a lot of us in this area has been really inspiring to me personally. Hearing about the successes and challenges in Alaska, and learning about Indigenous peoples across this Turtle Island, really. and hearing like the successes and challenges there. And just want to, reiterate that it's difficult work, but it's rewarding work, or none of us would be doing this. And also to the participants that are working directly in those LEAs, or maybe they're providing tribal services and support for our learners. I want to thank you as well. And if the lady's still on that had my students, tell them I said hello. But yeah, miigwech, everybody.
I want to thank the Federal Office of Indian Ed too. I don't know how many of you know, but we all know each other pretty well because of this national community of practice that we're privileged to be a part of. But one of the constants that's been in that group has also been the Office of Indian Education as our federal partner, and it's been significant for us in being able to move things in Michigan. So thanks also to the federal office as well.
And thanks to everyone who came today, who asked questions. The chat will continue to be here. You have the contact information for our presenters here. And there are some recorded sessions. I believe the Circles of Reflection session that happened right before this also included some state education agency folks talking about their experience. So lots more on this topic in some of our other sessions. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing about your work. And I'll see you soon.